December 1979, Soviet tanks rumbled across the Amu Darya River, crossing to Afghanistan. The official message was calm, bureaucratic, a limited military operation to assist a friendly government. In reality, it was the start of a war that would last nearly a decade and leave deep scars on both nations. The soldiers who crossed that bridge were young. They were told they were going to help rebuild, to protect villages, to defend socialism. They believed it. Instead, they entered a land where empires had always come to die. Afghanistan, a country of mountains and dust, where time itself seemed frozen, would soon consume everything they brought with them: their ideals, their strength, and their lives. For centuries, Afghanistan stood at the crossroads of empires. The British in the 19th century, the Persians before them. Every foreign power that tried to control this land eventually failed. Yet in 1978, the Soviet Union believed it could succeed where others had not. That year, a coup in Kabul brought the People's Democratic Party to power, a communist movement loyal to Moscow. Overnight, Afghanistan became a socialist ally. But the reforms were met with fierce resistance, especially among devout Muslims. Entire villages rose up against the new regime. As the rebellion spread, Afghan President Hafizullah Amin began to act on his own. Soviet advisors came under attack, and Moscow feared he might turn to the West. The KGB painted a grim picture. Afghanistan could fall under American influence, right on the Soviet border. On the night of December 27, 1979, the Soviet Union launched Operation Storm 333, a covert mission to eliminate Amin and seize control of Kabul. Elite special forces from the GRU and the KGB's Alpha unit took part, along with a unique formation known as the Muslim Battalion, soldiers from Central Asian republics who blended in more easily among Afghans. The assault on the presidential palace was swift and bloody. Amin was executed, and a new leader, Babur Karmal, was installed. He arrived not as a symbol of freedom, but as a man carried to power on Soviet bayonets. From that night on, the Soviet Union was no longer an observer. It had become a side of the conflict. The first weeks felt deceptively calm. Kabul was under control. Soviet troops were greeted with cautious curiosity, sometimes even with smiles. The leadership in Moscow declared the mission a success. Official newsreels showed soldiers helping farmers, distributing bread, rebuilding roads. They called it international duty, but beyond the capital, the truth was very different. The countryside was slipping away. Tribal leaders, mullahs, and warlords united under a single banner: jihad against the invader. From across the border in Pakistan came weapons, supplies, and foreign volunteers. In Washington, memories of Vietnam were still fresh. The long, costly war where communist forces, backed by the Soviet Union, had humiliated America. Now, the United States saw a chance to return the favor. Through the CIA's Operation Cyclone, billions of dollars in arms began flowing into Afghanistan. Rifles, rockets, and eventually, the weapon that would change the war, the American Stinger missile. With the Stinger, the balance shifted overnight. Soviet aircraft, once ruling the skies, became easy targets. Helicopters flew lower, transports avoided mountain routes, and fear crept into every mission. One of the most tragic moments came near Kabul, when an M-12 transport plane flying from the capital to Jalalabad was struck by a Stinger. The missile hit without warning, a bright flash in the sky, then silence. Everyone on board was killed, the crew and 21 passengers.
Смотрите, ребят. 'Командир, справа! 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 'Командир
After that, Soviet pilots began to say, quietly, the sky is no longer ours. In Moscow, they still called it a stabilization mission. In Afghanistan, it had already become a holy war. The Soviet army was trained for large-scale battles, tanks, artillery clear front lines. But Afghanistan offered none of that. But the Soviets weren't fighting a single organized army. They were fighting dozens of separate groups, tribal militias, foreign fighters, and local commanders, each with their own motives and loyalties. Many of them were Pashtun, hardened mountain fighters who knew every trail and cave. Others were Tajiks, among them a man who would become a legend, Ahmad Shah Massoud, the Lion of Panjshir. His forces operated from the Panjshir Valley, a natural fortress that defied repeated Soviet offensives. Unlike many warlords, Massoud was known for his discipline and pragmatism. Soviet commanders quietly respected him, calling him the most reasonable and capable of their adversaries, a man with whom, perhaps, peace could have been possible. As months turned into years, the war that was supposed to be quick and decisive became something else entirely. The Soviet army found itself trapped in a land that defied everything it had been trained for. There were no clear front lines, no great victories, only endless mountains and invisible enemies. The soldiers called it simply the zone, a place where days blurred together and survival became the only mission. Every valley was a potential ambush. Every convoy risked never returning. Soldiers learned to fear silence, because in silence, the enemy was already watching. Helicopter pilots flew low through narrow canyons, knowing one mistake meant death. Engineers cleared roads only to have them mined again by morning. Many began to question what they were fighting for, a revolution no one believed in or simply the man beside them. By the mid-1980s, it was impossible to hide the truth. Afghanistan had become a wound, one that bled resources, morale, and trust. Inside the Soviet Union, coffins returned in silence, marked cargo 200. Families received medals, but no answers. In 1986, Mikhail Gorbachev called the war a bleeding wound. He knew it could no longer be justified, politically or morally. The withdrawal began slowly, step by painful step. For the soldiers, the end felt unreal. After years of fear and survival, they were told to pack up and leave. The question hung in the air, for what? February 15, 1989, the last Soviet column crossed the Friendship Bridge. General Boris Grimov, the final commander, looked back and said, "Behind me, not a single Soviet soldier remains." The war was over, but it left behind a generation that would never be the same.
Я хочу сказать о том, что за мной ни одного советского солдата, офицера, прапорщика нет. На этом 9-летнее пребывание завершилось. Я хочу сказать еще.
They came home to a country that wanted to forget them. There were no victory parades, no celebrations, only indifference. The Soviet Union itself was collapsing, and the soldiers who returned found no place in the world they'd fought for. They were called Afghansy, not heroes, not villains, just men who had seen too much. Many carried invisible wounds, nightmares, addiction, guilt. The sound of a helicopter blade, the smell of diesel, the heat of summer, all could bring them back to that endless war. The government offered medals and silence. But silence doesn't heal. These men had been trained for war, not for peace. And when they returned to chaos, a country crumbling under its own weight, many were left with nothing. Some Afghans found work as bodyguards or mercenaries. Others fell into the shadows, becoming part of the criminal underworld that would define Russia's turbulent 1990s. In every city, monuments began to appear. Small, quiet stones with familiar names. Mothers came to lay flowers. They didn't ask why anymore. They just wanted their sons to be remembered. Decades later, another army entered Afghanistan. Different flag, different language, but the same promise: to bring freedom, to end terror, to rebuild a nation. 20 years later, they too left. Not in triumph, but in quiet disbelief. History, it seems, forgets quickly, but Afghanistan remembers everything. The mountains still stand, the dust still settles the same way, and the echoes of war still drift through the valleys. The Soviets called it international duty. The Americans called it the war on terror. The Afghans called it life. And when the last soldier leaves, the land remains ancient, silent, undefeated. Because no one truly leaves Afghanistan. Not in body, not in memory, not ever.